while the Oak Haven Police Department lived and breathed in a world of sirens, shouted commands, and the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder. Officer Jack Riley's universe was a climate-controlled sanctuary of silence. His kingdom was the records and archives room, a vast, tomb-like basement space where the only sounds were the gentle whisper of the ventilation system and the low electronic hum of servers processing the city's sins into neat, quantifiable data. Upstairs, chaos was currency. Detectives chased leads fueled by caffeine and adrenaline. Patrol officers wrestled with the messy, unpredictable realities of human desperation. But down here, chaos was tamed. It was captured, categorized, cross-referenced, and laid to rest in manila folders and encrypted digital files. Riley, a man of medium height and a quiet disposition that bordered on invisibility, was its keeper. In his mid-40s, with thinning hair and the pale complexion of a man who preferred fluorescent light to sunshine, he was more librarian than lawman. His weapon wasn't a Glock 19. It was a perfectly balanced spreadsheet. He found a deep, abiding solace in the order he created. He loved the cool, dry scent of aging paper, the satisfying thud of a new evidence seal, the clean, logical flow of a completed chain of custody form. To the cops upstairs, he was just Riley from the basement, a necessary cog in the bureaucratic machine, the guy you called when you needed a file from a cold case. They didn't understand that he saw the whole precinct, the whole city, in a way they never could. He saw it not as a series of isolated incidents, but as a sprawling tapestry of data. He saw the patterns, the statistical ghosts, the subtle ebbs and flows of crime that told a truer story than any single confession. This evening was no different. He was reconciling the quarterly property seizure logs, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a practiced, silent efficiency. The task was meditative. A stolen VCR from a 1998 burglary, logged and finally approved for disposal. A bag of counterfeit purses from a raid last month, awaiting incineration. Each item had a story, a life cycle, and it was his job to be its final chronicler. It was a world that made sense. Upstairs, the world made less sense. A frail, bird-like woman with a cloud of white hair and eyes clouded with a stubborn grief stood before the front desk. Her name was Agnes Gable, and for the third time this month, she was trying to explain her problem to an officer whose patience was visibly fraying. It was a photograph. She insisted, her voice thin but clear. Just a small one. Of my boy, Michael, on his graduation day. It was in his wallet when they took it for evidence. They never gave it back. Desk Sergeant Miller sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. Ma'am, as I've explained, the case is 20 years old. It was a robbery homicide. Your son was the victim. The case was closed. No conviction. The evidence would have been disposed of years ago. There's nothing to give back. But you have to look, she pleaded, her knuckles white as she gripped the high counter. It's the only copy I have of that picture. From the corner of his eye, Riley, on a rare trip upstairs to deliver a file, saw the exchange. He saw the dismissal in Sergeant Miller's eyes, the weary impatience. He saw Detective Eva Rostova, one of the department's star homicide investigators, stride past without giving the old woman a second glance, her mind already on a fresh murder downtown. To them, Mrs. Gable was a nuisance, a loose end from a forgotten story. Riley felt a familiar, quiet pang. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was a deep-seated aversion to untidiness, to a story left unfinished, a duty unfulfilled. He waited until the sergeant had finally managed to send Mrs. Gable to a waiting bench, promising someone would look into it with a tone that meant the exact opposite. He approached the desk. Sergeant, I can take a look for Mrs. Gable. Miller looked at him, surprised. Riley? It's a ghost file from 2 decades ago. Waste of time. We've got actual crime happening out there. It's no trouble, Riley said calmly. I have to purge the physical archives from that year anyway. I'll keep an eye out. He didn't wait for an argument. He walked over to the bench where Mrs. Gable sat, looking defeated. "Mrs. Gable," he said softly, and she looked up, startled. "My name is Officer Riley. I work in the archives. Why don't you come with me? It might take a while, but let's see if we can find Michael's picture." A flicker of hope ignited in her watery eyes. It was the first time anyone had used her son's name. For the next 2 hours, long after his shift had officially ended, Riley guided Agnes Gable through the silent canyons of shelves in the deep archives. He didn't just search, he worked. He pulled the master case file, a thick, dusty tome bound in faded blue. He cross-referenced the evidence manifest with the property log. He saw the notation, wallet, brown leather, contents inventoried. But the disposal order for the contents was separate, and it was missing a final signature, a loose thread. He then turned to the digital archives, his fingers a blur on the keyboard, pulling up scanned documents and transfer logs. He found the digital gap. The property was moved from central evidence to long-term storage, but the sub-items were never individually checked into the new system. It was a clerical error from a time of transitioning systems, the kind of mistake no one but him would ever care enough to find. "It should be in Sector Gamma, Bay 12, Box 44B, he announced finally, a quiet triumph in his voice. He led her to a dim corner of the warehouse, pulled down a heavy cardboard box, and blew a thick layer of dust from its lid. Inside, nestled amongst other cold, forgotten items and evidence bags, was a small, sealed plastic pouch, and inside the pouch was a slightly faded, wallet-sized photograph of a young man in a cap and gown, smiling a wide, hopeful smile. Agnes Gable let out a small, choked sob as Riley carefully cut open the bag and handed her the picture. She clutched it to her chest, her whole body shaking. "Michael," she whispered. "Oh, my boy." She looked at Riley, her eyes overflowing with a gratitude so profound it was humbling. "Thank you. Oh, God. Thank you, officer." Riley simply nodded, a faint, rare smile touching his lips. "I'm just glad we could find him." "Ma'am." He didn't need praise. The closed loop, the finished story, the righted entry in the great ledger that was his reward. Later that night, as he was performing the final closing procedures for the month, he returned to his regular work, the small act of kindness already receding as he immersed himself in his data. He was finalizing the destruction manifests for high-value narcotics and currency seizures. It was routine. Check the case number, verify the supervising officer's signature on the physical log, and digitally authorize the destruction certificate. He pulled up the file for a major cocaine bust from 3 weeks prior. Case 714B. Supervised by the department's elite narcotics task force. The digital paperwork was all in order. He glanced at the scanned copy of the physical sign-out sheet. The signature of the unit's lieutenant was there. The official evidence-destroyed stamp was in its place. And yet, something pricked at the edge of his perception. He leaned closer to the monitor, zooming in on the stamp. It was a standard issue, self-inking stamp used by the hundreds in the department. But this one, it was off. By no more than a millimeter. Maybe 2. The bottom edge was slightly canted to the right. A tiny, almost imperceptible flaw. He wouldn't have noticed it. Except he'd processed another task force seizure report earlier that day, and the stamp had been perfect. Curious. He pulled up a dozen recent destruction reports, all the ones from homicide, robbery, patrol. The stamps were clean, perfectly aligned. Then he filtered for only the narcotics task force. He pulled up another high-value seizure from the month before. There it was again. The same infinitesimal tilt. A third one, from 2 months back, involving over $100,000 in seized cash. Same stamp. Same tilt. It was nothing. A faulty stamp. A heavy-handed user. A statistical coincidence. But Riley's mind didn't easily accept coincidence. He looked closer. This time at the scanned signature of the lieutenant on the tilted stamp reports. He compared it to the man's signature on other, non-seizure-related documents. The shape was identical, the flow perfect. But the ink, on his high-resolution monitor, he could just barely discern a difference in the pixelation. The ink on the seizure forms seemed a fraction of a shade darker, its edges bleeding just a tiny bit more into the paper fibers, as if from a pen with a slightly different viscosity. It was a ghost in the machine, a whisper of an anomaly in an ocean of data. It was probably nothing, a different pen, a worn-out stamp. He should dismiss it, authorize the certificate, and go home. But he didn't. He saved the file without authorization. He created a new, encrypted folder on his personal partition, naming it simply Query. He dragged the anomalous reports into it. He felt a low thrum of something unfamiliar, a dissonant chord in the quiet symphony of his work. It was the feeling of a story that wasn't over, a ledger that didn't balance, and for the first time in a long time, Officer Jack Riley felt the cold, thrilling prickle of a pattern he did not understand. The dissonant chord Riley had felt in the quiet of his archives became a deafening roar 3 days later. The catalyst wasn't a corrupted file or a missing ledger. It was a human tragedy that shattered the sterile peace of his world. It came in the form of a department-wide email with a subject line that made his blood run cold: Workplace accident. Pops Callahan, the precinct's semi-retired evidence clerk, had taken a fall. That's what the email said. A simple, tragic accident down the steep, concrete steps leading to the deep evidence warehouse. Plausible. Pops was 71, a precinct institution with a whiskey-gravel voice and knees that creaked louder than the ancient filing cabinets. He was supposed to be fishing off a pier in Florida in 6 months, enjoying a hard-earned pension. Instead, he was in the ICU at Oak Haven General with a fractured skull and 2 broken ribs. The official report was filed with unnerving speed. Signed off by a young, ambitious detective from Deputy Chief Thorne's own unit, it declared the incident a straightforward, non-suspicious accident. Case closed. But to Riley, the speed of that closure felt less like efficiency and more like a door being slammed shut. Grief hit Riley with a surprising, physical force. Pops was more than just a colleague. He was Riley's only real friend in the department. He was the only one who saw the value in Riley's meticulous work, who understood the language of the archives. They shared lunches in the basement, complaining about the precinct's terrible coffee and trading stories, Pops about the old days of street policing, Riley about the elegant logic of data. Pops called him Kid, even though Riley was well into his 40s. The thought of the basement without Pops's wheezing laugh felt profoundly, unacceptably empty. That evening, Riley went to the hospital. The air smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair. He found Pops in a private room, a small, frail figure lost in a sea of white sheets and blinking machines. A thick white bandage was wrapped around his head, and purple bruises bloomed across his weathered face. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow. Riley sat by the bed for nearly an hour, the silence broken only by the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. He was about to leave when Pops's eyelids fluttered open. His gaze was unfocused, cloudy with pain and medication. But he seemed to recognize Riley. His chapped lips moved, and Riley had to lean in close to hear the whispered, raspy words. "Kid," Pops breathed, his voice a ghost of its usual gravelly tone. "Gotta watch out." "Easy, Pops. Just rest," Riley said softly, placing a hand on the old man's arm. But a spark of urgency flickered in Pops's eyes. He gripped Riley's wrist with surprising strength. "No. Listen. The ledger. Ghosts in the ledger." His breath hitched. Funky paperwork. Was looking. Before the push. The word hung in the air between them, electric and terrifying. Push. Push, Riley repeated, his heart starting to pound. Pops. Did someone push you? But the effort was too much. Pops's eyes rolled back slightly. His grip slackened, and he slipped back into the fog of unconsciousness, leaving Riley alone with the echo of that single, horrifying word. Walking out of the hospital and into the cool night air, Riley's world had been fundamentally altered. Grief was now intertwined with a cold, sharp-edged suspicion. He knew Pops. The man was old, but he was cautious. He treated the warehouse stairs with the respect a sailor treats a storm-tossed sea, and he had been looking into funky paperwork. He had seen ghosts in the ledger, the same ledger Riley patrolled. The coincidence was too great, too monstrous to ignore. Riley's quiet, orderly life was over. He had stood at a crossroads and, without conscious thought, had taken the path that led away from the safety of his archives and into the darkness. This was no longer about a misaligned stamp or a statistical anomaly. This was about his friend. This was about a potential murder, disguised as an accident, right under the roof of the police department. He went back to the precinct. The night shift was on, a skeleton crew operating under the hum of low-level activity. No one paid any attention to the records clerk heading back to his basement domain. He was a part of the building, as unremarkable as the flickering fluorescent lights. But tonight, he felt like a spy in his own home, driven by a loyalty that burned hotter than any fear. Riley sat at his terminal and began to dig. He needed to know what Pops had been looking at. He bypassed the standard user interface and delved into the server's raw access logs, a place where every keystroke and file view was recorded. He filtered for Pops's user ID, tracing his digital footprints from the hours before the fall. The logs were a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to the heart of the anomaly. Pops had been running queries on the very same high-value seizure reports from the narcotics task force that had troubled Riley, the ones with the tilted stamp. He had been cross-referencing their evidence numbers with the physical checkout logs for the incinerator. Riley's hands grew cold. He followed the trail, his heart pounding in time with his keystrokes. He pulled up the master report for the incinerator run on the day of Pops's accident, and there it was. The ghost in the machine had become a phantom menace, a major heroin seizure from a downtown raid, logged as transported and destroyed. The authorization form was attached, bearing the now infamous misaligned stamp. The anomaly was no longer a curiosity. It was the potential motive for his friend's attempted murder. Pops had found the same loose thread Riley had, but he had pulled on it, and something on the other end had pulled back with deadly force. Riley knew what he had to do. The knowledge was a lead weight in his gut, but the path was clear. He couldn't go to internal affairs if the corruption was deep enough to attempt to kill a cop. IA could be compromised. He couldn't go to the detectives upstairs, who saw him as little more than a file clerk. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone. He took a deep breath. With practiced, deliberate movements, he inserted a high-capacity, encrypted flash drive into a shielded USB port on his terminal. It was a piece of personal kit from his former life in IT, a digital black box he never thought he'd need. He initiated a transfer, copying every anomalous file, every log Pops had accessed, every shred of data related to the Narcotics Task Force's high-value seizures from the last 2 years. The progress bar on his screen was a slow-crawling measure of his own treason. He was violating a dozen department protocols. If caught, he would lose his job, his pension, and could even face criminal charges. But as he watched the kilobytes turn into megabytes, he felt no fear. The grief for Pops had burned it away, leaving behind only a cold, hard resolve. When the transfer was complete, he ejected the drive and slipped it into his pocket. It felt heavier than a loaded gun. He stood up from his desk and looked around the silent, familiar room. It was no longer his sanctuary. It was the first battlefield in a war he didn't ask for but could no longer escape. He had crossed a line. There was no going back to his quiet, orderly life. He now held the ledger, and he was determined to make it balance, no matter the cost. Working from his home computer, with the encrypted drive connected, Riley's small apartment transformed into a clandestine operations center. The city slept outside his window, oblivious to the war being waged in lines of code and columns of data. With the files he'd copied, he was no longer just looking at a tilted stamp. He was staring into the abyss of a sophisticated conspiracy. The pattern was chillingly clear. For every high-value seizure logged by the Narcotics Task Force kilos of cocaine, bricks of heroin, duffel bags full of cash. The same sequence occurred. The evidence was checked into the warehouse. The physical paperwork was immaculate. But the digital trail told a different story. Riley discovered that the official authorization for the evidence's destruction was being digitally signed and timestamped before the physical evidence was ever logged out for transport to the incinerator. Sometimes hours before, sometimes a full day. It was the equivalent of signing a death certificate before the patient had died. It was a perfect crime, hidden in plain sight within the bureaucracy. Someone was creating a clean digital history, a fabricated, unassailable alibi for evidence that was, in all likelihood, never destroyed. It was being diverted, stolen from the very heart of the justice system. The tilted stamp wasn't a mistake. It was a mark of authenticity for the forgery. But proving it was another matter. The discrepancy existed in the server's back-end metadata, not in the user-facing reports. To get incontrovertible proof, he needed access to the raw, unalterable server logs, the system's digital DNA. It was a level of access far beyond that of a records clerk, protected by layers of encryption and security protocols designed to keep people exactly like him out. And so, Riley was forced to resurrect a ghost from his own past. Before he was a cop, before the quiet order of the archives had called to him, he had been a different man. He had been a data recovery specialist for a high-end cybersecurity firm, one of those digital wizards who could pull secrets from shattered hard drives and corrupted servers. He'd left that world because he was tired of the moral ambiguity, tired of working for corporations whose ethics were as fluid as their stock prices. He'd joined the OHPD seeking a simpler, clearer purpose. Now, that past he'd tried to bury had become his only weapon. He logged into the precinct's network remotely, his credentials still valid. He navigated to the server's security gateway, a digital wall he wasn't supposed to be able to see, let alone climb. His fingers, which usually danced across filing systems, now moved with a different, more predatory rhythm, typing lines of code into a command prompt. He exploited a long-forgotten backdoor he'd noticed during a system migration years ago, a flaw in the architecture only a true specialist would recognize. He wasn't hacking the system so much as whispering to it in its native language, persuading it to open doors it was supposed to keep shut. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, he had it. He was in raw timestamp data, immutable audit trails. The system's core truth, it was all there, laid bare on his screen. He worked feverishly, downloading the specific logs he needed, the digital fingerprints that would prove the fraud beyond any doubt. It was the most dangerous thing he had ever done, a flagrant violation of every rule, but it was a necessary sacrilege. Across town, in the brightly lit homicide division, Detective Eva Rostova was staring at her own screen, a frown creasing her brow. She was sharp, ambitious, and deeply dedicated to her job. She viewed the law not as a set of abstract rules, but as a weapon to be wielded against the chaos that constantly threatened to consume the city. She had immense respect for the chain of command, particularly for Deputy Chief Marcus Thorne, a man she saw as the epitome of modern, effective policing. He was charismatic, politically astute, and had personally mentored her. Thorne had called her that morning. His tone was one of concerned leadership. He'd mentioned the tragic accident with Pops Callahan and noted that his friend, the records clerk Riley, was understandably distraught. "Just keep an eye on his productivity, Ava," Thorne had said smoothly. "Grief can make a man unfocused. We need to make sure the archives are secure." Rostova had accepted the task without question. To her, it was a sign of the deputy chief's thoroughness. So when an automated security flag popped up on the IT department's monitoring software she had access to as a lead detective, her interest was piqued. The flag indicated an unusual remote access event originating from a low-level user ID. User J. Riley. She watched, intrigued. She didn't understand the complex data strings scrolling across the log, but she understood privilege levels. She saw a records clerk, a glorified pencil pusher in her mind, accessing the server's protected root directory. It was like seeing a janitor attempting to open the evidence vault. Her cop instincts kicked in. A grieving, unstable clerk with high-level access was a security breach waiting to happen. She took a screenshot of the activity log and, feeling a small surge of dutiful pride, sent it in a confidential email directly to Deputy Chief Thorne. Sir, per your request, I was monitoring archival security and noticed this suspicious activity. Thought you should be aware. In his spacious corner office, Marcus Thorne saw the email and his blood ran cold. The screenshot was a hieroglyph of disaster that only he could fully decipher. He saw past the lines of code and recognized the digital signature of a truly skilled operator. This wasn't some grieving clerk randomly clicking on files. This was a scalpel, precisely cutting its way toward the Syndicate's heart. The quiet man from the basement, the man he had dismissed as a harmless eccentric, was a genuine threat. The accident with Pops Callahan hadn't solved the problem. It had created a far more dangerous one. Thorne's public persona was one of unflappable calm, and he did not let it slip. He leaned back in his leather chair, his mind racing, plotting moves 3 steps ahead. The first step was to control the messenger. He called Rostova immediately. "Detective, thank you," he said, his voice a warm current of praise. "This is exactly the kind of proactive policing I admire. Your instincts are first-rate. You've likely flagged a serious vulnerability." He made her feel like a hero, a valued part of his inner circle. He had just turned his unwitting spy into a loyal asset. The second step was to wall off the threat. After ending the call with Rostova, he summoned the head of the IT department. "We have a security issue," he declared, his face a mask of grave concern. "I want a full, department-wide systems update, new security patches, forced password resets, a full credential review. Immediately. I don't care about the overtime. The integrity of our data is paramount." By the next morning, Riley's world had shrunk. When he tried to log into his work terminal, a curt message flashed on the screen: access denied. His credentials had been revoked. He was locked out of the very archives that were his life's work. A moment later, his desk phone rang. It was the Deputy Chief's administrative assistant. "Officer Riley, Chief Thorne has reassigned your duties temporarily, pending the completion of the system-wide security review," the voice said, devoid of emotion. "There's a backlog of physical files from the county merger in 2008 that need to be manually sorted and indexed. The pallets are waiting for you in storage room C." Riley knew exactly what that meant. It was a punishment, a deliberate exile. Storage room C was a windowless closet in the sub-basement, filled with thousands of moldering, disorganized documents. It was a task that would take weeks, if not months. It was a mountain of paper designed to bury him alive, to keep him as far away from the digital truth as possible. He hung up the phone, the silence of his now inaccessible office pressing in on him. The enemy knew. They didn't know what he had, but they knew he was digging. They had retaliated, not with violence, but with the cold, crushing weight of the bureaucracy he had once found so comforting. He was locked out, isolated, and officially sidelined. The initial confrontation was over, and he had, to all outward appearances, lost. But in his pocket, the encrypted drive felt like a burning coal, a secret that could still burn the whole corrupt system to the ground. Exile was a windowless room in the sub-basement, smelling of mildew and forgotten time. For days, Riley was buried in the mountain of paper Thorne had assigned him. The task was Sisyphean, a deliberate effort to crush his spirit under the sheer weight of meaningless bureaucracy. He sorted, indexed, and filed, his hands stained with ink and grime. To anyone watching, he was a defeated man, a clerk put back in his place. But they weren't watching his mind. With every moldering document he touched, his resolve hardened. The physical isolation only sharpened his mental focus. He knew the data on his encrypted drive was the key, but it was incomplete. Digital ghosts needed a physical body to be convicted. He had the what, but not the who. The digital log showed the crime, but the original, hand-signed master ledgers from the evidence warehouse were the only things that could tie the specific forgeries to the specific officers who signed them. While Riley toiled in his paper tomb, Deputy Chief Thorne was moving to eliminate the final threat. He couldn't risk Riley, or anyone else, ever finding the physical proof. He needed a fire, a big, legal, and irreversible fire. He called a meeting with the department captains. With his characteristic blend of charm and authority, he laid out a case for a critical evidence purge. He spoke of efficiency, of modernizing storage protocols, of freeing up desperately needed space for new cases. "Look at this place," he said, striding through the central evidence warehouse, the arena for his final move. The warehouse was the precinct's physical memory, a vast, shadowy labyrinth of towering steel shelves groaning under the weight of a decade's worth of crime and tragedy. Cardboard boxes, plastic bins, and tagged rifles were stacked to the ceiling, creating narrow canyons of ordered chaos. It was the heart of the department's integrity, and, as Riley knew, the Syndicate's primary feeding ground. "We are drowning in history," Thorne declared. "We have evidence from closed cases going back 15 years. It's a liability. It's a mess. It's time to clean house." He proposed a massive, one-time purge. An industrial shredding truck and a mobile incinerator would be brought in. All non-essential, closed case evidence older than 7 years would be legally and permanently destroyed. It was a perfectly logical, defensible, and even commendable administrative action. It was also a death sentence for Riley's investigation. The master ledgers he needed were paper, and they were well over 7 years old. The captains, eager to please the charismatic deputy chief, agreed immediately. The purge was scheduled. It would begin in 24 hours. A department-wide memo was issued. Riley saw the memo on a communal computer when he surfaced from his basement prison for a cup of coffee. The words hit him like a physical blow. Critical evidence purge. Incineration protocols. All materials listed in Appendix A. He didn't need to see the appendix. He knew the ledgers would be on it. Thorne wasn't just closing a door, he was burning the whole building down. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. 24 hours. He had less than 24 hours before his entire investigation was turned to ash. His isolation was now absolute. Pops was still in the hospital, his condition stable but still too weak for visitors. The few officers who had been friendly to Riley now averted their eyes, afraid of being associated with the man who had fallen from the deputy chief's grace. And Detective Rostova, when he passed her in the hall, gave him a look of such open hostility and contempt that it felt like a slap. In her eyes, he was a troublemaker, a paranoid clerk who had abused his privileges and was now deservedly buried in the basement. He was completely, utterly alone. There was only one path left. He couldn't request the ledgers. His access was revoked, and he was under a cloud of suspicion. Any official request would be denied and would alert Thorne. He had to go in himself. He had to break into the evidence warehouse, the most secure room in the entire precinct, and steal the proof he needed to save the department from itself. That night, Riley put his plan into motion. He waited until 2 a.m., when the precinct was at its quietest, running on a skeleton crew of weary night shifters. He bypassed the main building, using an old fire escape to get onto the roof. From his years of studying the building's blueprints, a task he'd once done out of simple curiosity, he knew of a ventilation shaft that led directly down into a maintenance corridor adjacent to the warehouse. The descent was terrifying. The shaft was narrow, dark, and slick with grime. He moved slowly, his heart pounding against his ribs, every scrape of his shoes echoing in the metal tube. He emerged into the corridor, covered in filth but undetected. He was now in the guts of the building, a ghost in the machine. The warehouse door was a formidable obstacle, a reinforced steel door with a high-security electronic lock. But Thorne's systems update had created an unforeseen opportunity. In their haste to lock Riley out, It had implemented a new proximity card system. Riley, from his study of the update protocols, knew that for a 48-hour transitional period, the old magnetic stripe system was still running as a backup, and he still had his old ID card. The problem was the access log. Swiping his card would leave a digital record of his presence. He had to disable the logger for the specific reader on that door, and only for the few seconds it would take him to swipe. He pulled out a small, custom-built device from his pocket, something he'd pieced together from old computer parts and electronic jammer. It was a desperate, long-shot gamble. He held his breath and activated the device. A small LED flickered. He swiped his card. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, he heard a soft, beautiful click as the magnetic lock disengaged. He slid the door open just enough to slip through, then closed it silently behind him. He was in. The warehouse was cavernous and silent, a cathedral of secrets. The only light came from the faint, green glow of the emergency exit signs. He moved through the narrow aisles, a shadow among shadows, using a small penlight to read the labels on the shelves. He was searching for a needle in a haystack, and the haystack was scheduled to be burned at dawn. He knew from the archiving system that the older financial ledgers were stored in the long-term administrative records section. He found the area, a towering wall of identical cardboard boxes. The box he needed would be labeled something innocuous, something no one would ever think to look in. He started scanning, his light dancing across the labels. Uniform requisitions, 05. Vehicle maintenance, 07. Ammunition audits, 09. Time stretched and compressed. Every distant sound from the main precinct building, a cough. A closing door made him freeze. He was an intruder, a criminal in the heart of the law. If he was caught here, Thorne's narrative would be complete. The disgruntled clerk, caught stealing records, fabricating a conspiracy. His life would be over. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw it. A box on a high shelf, almost out of reach, with a faded, handwritten label, Office Supply Budgets, 2004-2008. It was perfect in its banality. No one would ever look for a conspiracy in a box of old pencil requisitions. He climbed the rolling ladder, his movements clumsy in the dark. He pulled the heavy box down. His hands trembled as he opened the flaps. Inside, beneath a layer of actual office supply invoices from a forgotten decade, were the books. 5 thick, leather-bound ledgers. The original, hand-signed master logs for the evidence warehouse. He had them. He had the truth in his hands. He was about to close the box when a sound made his blood freeze. A soft click. Not the sound of a lock disengaging, but the sharp, unmistakable sound of a light switch being flicked on. The cavernous warehouse was instantly flooded with harsh, unforgiving fluorescent light. Riley was caught in the open, exposed, blinking like a nocturnal animal blinded by the dawn. At the far end of the main aisle, silhouetted against the light, stood a figure. And then another. Riley's heart sank like a stone. He wasn't alone. They had been waiting for him. The gauntlet had not been the break-in. The gauntlet was just beginning. The figures stepped out of the blinding light, their forms solidifying into Riley's worst fears. At the front, radiating an aura of smug triumph, was Deputy Chief Marcus Thorne. Flanking him were 2 of the largest, most brutish officers from the Narcotics Task Force, men known more for their muscle than their minds. And just behind them, her face a confused mask of duty and suspicion, was Detective Eva Rostova. She held her service weapon at a low ready, her eyes fixed on Riley, seeing not a colleague, but a cornered criminal. Well, Officer Riley," Thorne said, his voice echoing in the vast, silent warehouse. He strolled forward slowly, his expensive shoes clicking on the concrete floor. He was savoring the moment. "Working late, I see, or should I say, stealing late." Riley's heart hammered against his ribs. He was trapped. He stood frozen. the heavy box of ledgers clutched in his hands like a useless shield. His mind raced, searching for an escape route, an angle, but there was none. He was surrounded, outgunned, and caught red-handed. "I expected more from you, Rostova," Thorne said over his shoulder, never taking his eyes off Riley. "I asked you to keep an eye on him, and here he is, trying to abscond with official department records. It's a good thing I had my own suspicions." He was painting the narrative, framing her as his diligent subordinate, erasing any trace of his own manipulation. Rostova's eyes narrowed at Riley, her expression hardening. "On the ground. Riley, now hands where I can see them," she commanded, her voice sharp and authoritative. Slowly, carefully. Riley placed the box on the floor and raised his hands. The game was over. He had failed. Thorne circled him like a shark, a predatory smile playing on his lips. "You really thought you could outsmart me, didn't you? You little basement troll digging around in files, talking to that old drunk Callahan. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" He stopped directly in front of Riley, his towering frame casting a long shadow. And then, with the supreme confidence of a man who believed he was utterly untouchable, he began to confess. "You found the ghost. I'll give you that," Thorne admitted, his voice dropping to a conversational, almost admiring tone. "It was a beautiful system. Clean. Efficient. We'd take the real evidence, the drugs, the cash, and replace it with high-grade counterfeit lookalikes. The fakes get weighed, photographed, and incinerated. The real product goes back out on the street through our own channels. Everybody wins. The department gets its stats. The city thinks we're winning the war on drugs, and we get a well-deserved retirement fund." Rostova flinched as if struck. Her gaze darted from Thorne to Riley, confusion warring with a dawning horror. This wasn't the gotcha moment of catching a rogue clerk. This was something else entirely. "Pops got too curious," Thorne continued, his tone turning cold. "He was a good cop in his day, but he should have learned to leave well enough alone. A little nudge down the stairs. It was supposed to be a warning. But you just had to pick at the thread. And now, you've unraveled." He gestured to the box of ledgers at Riley's feet. "This is perfect. We find you here, having broken in, trying to steal evidence. It's clear you're the ringleader of a little blackmail scheme, trying to frame good officers. And then, tragically," he looked at his two hulking enforcers, "you resist arrest. You lunge for an officer's weapon. We had no choice but to neutralize the threat. Your death will be a sad but necessary footnote in a commendation for Detective Rostova here, who bravely uncovered your conspiracy." This was it. The abyss. The all-is-lost moment descended on Riley with suffocating weight. Thorne had planned for every contingency. He would be murdered here, in the cold heart of the warehouse, and posthumously disgraced. Rostova stood frozen, a pawn in a monstrous play she was only now beginning to understand, her gun suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in her hand. The truth would be buried with him. It was in that moment of absolute despair that Riley found a strange, unexpected calm. He had one move left, a move so audacious, so improbable, that it was his only hope. He slowly lowered his hands and looked directly at Thorne, a flicker of something that wasn't fear in his eyes. "You're right, Chief," Riley said, his voice steady. "It was a beautiful system, and a confession this clean deserves a wider audience." Thorne laughed, a short, barking sound of contempt. "What's that? You going to scream for help? No one's coming. Riley." "I don't need to scream," Riley said. He casually tapped the center of his chest, on the second button of his nondescript work shirt. "You see, Chief, the problem with most police wires is that they're low fidelity and require a warrant. A smart defense attorney could get the recording thrown out." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Thorne's face. "But this," Riley continued, his voice gaining strength, "isn't a police wire. It's a high-fidelity digital audio recorder. and it's been streaming everything you've said for the last 5 minutes, live, to a secure, anonymous cloud server. The file is already uploaded, time-stamped, and beyond your reach. Thorne's smile faltered. He took a half-step back. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Riley asked. "But you're right. An audio recording can be disputed. People can claim coercion, or that the voice was faked. You need video for a conviction to really stick." And then Riley delivered the masterstroke. "That's why the button right above it," he said, nodding toward the top button on his shirt, "is a wide-angle, high-definition camera, and it's been streaming too." He looked past Thorne, at the horrified face of Eva Rostova. "The thing is, a video stream needs a receiver, an accomplice." "There's no one else here," Thorne snarled, his composure finally cracking. "My accomplice isn't in the room," Riley said. "He's in a bed at Oak Haven General. You see, when you revoked my credentials, you forgot about the old-timers. Pops Callahan never turned in his old IT administrator password from 10 years ago. It was still dormant in the system. I just reactivated it for him." From his hospital bed, using a tablet computer Riley had smuggled into him, Pops Callahan, the old man they'd left for dead, had performed his last act as a police officer. With his arthritic fingers, he typed a few lines of code, hacking into his own department's network. He took the live video feed from Riley's hidden camera and patched it directly into the precinct's internal broadcast system. At that exact moment, in the main briefing room upstairs, the entire morning shift had gathered for roll call. They were drinking coffee, trading jokes, preparing for another day on the streets. Suddenly, the large monitors on the wall, which usually displayed weather maps and bulletins, flickered and changed. The image that appeared was grainy, shot from a low angle, but the subjects were unmistakable. They were looking at a live feed from their own evidence warehouse, and they watched, in stunned, absolute silence, as their deputy chief, a man they admired and respected, confessed to running a narcotics syndicate, to stealing evidence, and to the attempted murder of one of their own. The reaction in the briefing room was a wave of pure, collective shock that quickly curdled into horror, and then ignited into a righteous, unadulterated fury. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it left them breathless. Chairs scraped back, jaws dropped, and then, as one, the sea of blue uniforms rose and began moving, a tide of angry, betrayed cops surging toward the elevators, their faces set like stone. Down in the warehouse, Thorne was still processing Riley's words when he heard it. A distant rumble. The sound of dozens of heavy boots pounding down the corridor. The sound of his world ending. The doors to the warehouse burst open, and the room was flooded with uniformed officers, their faces a mixture of disbelief and rage. They saw Thorne, his enforcers, and a horrified Rostova standing over the records clerk from the basement. And they saw the truth. Detective Eva Rostova was the first to react. The spell of Thorne's authority shattered. She turned on him, her face a mask of cold fury, and with a swift, practiced movement, she holstered her own weapon and ripped the gun from Thorne's hand before he could even think to raise it. "You son of a bitch!" she hissed, the words dripping with venom. Riley stood amidst the chaos, his heart still pounding but his mind strangely clear. He had brought the ledger into the light, and now it was finally, devastatingly, balanced. The chaos that erupted in the evidence warehouse was not the wild, violent pandemonium of a riot. It was the focused, cold fury of a betrayed brotherhood. The uniformed officers who flooded the room moved with a grim purpose, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and righteous anger. They surrounded Thorne and his two stunned enforcers, not as colleagues, but as a pack of wolves cornering a predator that had turned on its own. For a moment, Thorne seemed to believe his authority still held. He drew himself up, his face contorting into a mask of indignation. "Stand down!" he bellowed, his voice accustomed to instant obedience. "All of you arrest this man!" He pointed a shaking finger at Riley. No one moved. The only response was a low, collective growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The spell was broken. His power, which had been absolute moments before, had evaporated into thin air. It was Eva Rostova who sealed his fate. The horror on her face had been replaced by a glacial fury. In her mind, Thorn hadn't just been a criminal, he had desecrated the badge, the very idea of the law she had dedicated her life to upholding. He had made a fool of her, used her ambition and loyalty as tools for his own filth. With a movement so swift it was a blur, she stepped forward and snatched a pair of handcuffs from the belt of a nearby officer. "Marcus Thorn," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion save for contempt. "You are under arrest." The click of the steel cuffs locking around Thorn's wrists was the loudest sound in the warehouse. It was the sound of an empire falling. Thorn's two enforcers, seeing their leader captured and the tide of blue uniforms ready to tear them apart, wisely surrendered without a fight, their brutish confidence crumbling into pathetic fear. Within the hour, the Oakhaven Police Department was no longer its own. The FBI, summoned by an emergency call from the acting captain, descended upon the precinct like a conquering army. Agents in dark windbreakers swarmed the building, securing crime scenes, seizing computers, and placing the entire department on administrative lockdown. The precinct had become a cancer, and the federal government had arrived to perform radical surgery. Thorn and his co-conspirators were whisked away in unmarked black sedans, their perp walks illuminated by the flashing lights of news cameras that had materialized out of the night. The story of the lone Justicar in the basement had exploded into a national scandal. Riley was escorted to a small, quiet office, the eye of the storm. He spent hours with two stone-faced FBI agents, methodically detailing his entire investigation, from the first sight of the tilted stamp to the live feed from the warehouse. He handed over the encrypted drive and the master ledgers, his evidence now in the hands of the only people he could trust. They listened without interruption, their expressions unreadable, but Riley could sense a grudging respect in their professional focus. When he finished, they simply nodded and told him not to leave town. He was sitting alone in that borrowed office, the adrenaline finally draining away and leaving behind a profound exhaustion. When the door opened, it was Detective Rostova. She looked as exhausted as he felt. Her hair was disheveled, and the sharp, confident edges of her demeanor had softened into something more vulnerable. She stood there for a long moment, simply looking at him. "I just finished my preliminary statement with the feds," she said, her voice quiet. "I told them everything. How Thorn manipulated me. How I was too arrogant to see what was right in front of my face." Riley said nothing, waiting. She took a step into the room. "I came here to apologize." "Riley, no, that's not right." She shook her head, frustrated with herself. "An apology isn't enough. I misjudged you. Completely. I saw a clerk, a pencil pusher. I saw someone who didn't belong in the real world of policing." She met his eyes, and for the first time, he saw not hostility, but a raw, painful honesty. "I was wrong. You were more of a cop in that basement than I've been in a long time. You were upholding the law while I was blindly saluting the man who was breaking it. I'm sorry." It was a stark, unvarnished admission of failure, delivered with the same blunt force she usually reserved for interrogations. Coming from a detective as proud as Eva Rostova, it was the equivalent of a sworn affidavit. "You were following the chain of command, Detective," Riley said, his voice weary but without malice. "That's what you were trained to do." "No," she countered immediately. "I was trained to seek the truth. I just chose to believe the more convenient one." "You didn't." A newfound respect colored her words. "If you ever need a partner who watches the real evidence instead of the shiny exterior, you know where to find me." She turned and left, leaving Riley with the first sign that the department, however broken, might one day be repaired. His final meeting of the day was with Captain Davies, a gruff, old-school homicide commander with 25 years on the force who had been named acting chief. Davies was a man of few words, known for his integrity and his perpetually sour expression. He summoned Riley to the deputy chief's office, Thorne's former seat of power. Riley entered, expecting a formal reprimand for his litany of broken protocols. Davies was sitting behind the massive mahogany desk, looking profoundly uncomfortable, as if the chair might be contaminated. "Riley," he grunted, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Sit." Riley sat. Davies stared at him for a full minute. "You broke about 50 department regulations. You went off the books, conducted an unauthorized investigation, hacked our servers, and illegally recorded a superior officer. By the book, I should have your badge." Riley remained silent. "But the book," Davies continued, leaning forward, "was written by men like Thorne. Men who know how to use the rules to hide their crimes. You used the truth to break them." He sighed, a sound like gravel shifting. "The FBI is going to be running this show for months. When the dust settles, this department is going to have to be rebuilt from the ground up. Our reputation is shot. Our public trust is zero." He opened a folder on the desk. It was Riley's personnel file. "Before you were a cop, you were some kind of computer genius." "Data recovery specialist," Riley corrected quietly. "Whatever." Davies waved a dismissive hand. "We need that. We don't just need cops who can kick down doors. We need someone who can see the termites in the foundation before the whole house collapses. I'm creating a new unit. An independent data integrity unit. A digital internal affairs. It'll answer to me. And only to me." He pushed a detective's shield across the polished desk. It was new and gleamed under the office lights. "The unit is yours to build from scratch, if you want it." Riley looked at the shield. It represented a world he had never sought, a level of authority he had never wanted. But he also saw it as a tool, a way to ensure that the ledgers, both digital and moral, would never again be so dangerously unbalanced. "I'll take it," he said. Later that week, he visited Pops Callahan. The old man was out of the ICU and into a regular room, sitting up in bed and complaining about the hospital food. His bruises were fading, and the spark of life was back in his eyes. They talked for a while, the conversation easy and familiar. Finally, Riley told him about the new unit, about the shield. Pops beamed, a wide, proud smile. "Detective Riley," he said, testing the sound of it. "I knew you had it in you, kid." He grew serious, his gaze sharp. "You know, all these years, I thought your talent was being neat. But I was wrong." He pointed a gnarled finger at Riley. "Your talent isn't about keeping the records straight. It's that you're the only one who ever bothered to read them. All those hotshot detectives upstairs, they write the stories, file them away, and forget them. You read the stories, kid. You saw the parts that didn't make sense, and you gave the story a proper ending." Riley looked out the hospital window at the city below. For the first time, he didn't see it as a collection of potential crime scenes or data points. He saw it as a place full of stories, stories that needed guardians. He finally felt at peace. He had brought the ledger into the light, and in doing so, had found a new, quiet place for himself within it. 1 year later, the fluorescent lights of the Oak Haven Police Department seemed to burn a little brighter. The scent of stale coffee and cynicism that had once permeated the halls had been largely replaced by the smell of fresh paint and a fragile, hard-won sense of purpose. The department was still scarred, its reputation still undergoing a slow and painful rehabilitation in the public eye. But the cancer of Thorne's Syndicate had been excised. The healing had begun. The basement, once Riley's solitary kingdom, was no longer a forgotten archive. It had been transformed into the state-of-the-art headquarters of the Data Integrity Unit, a division that had already become legendary within state law enforcement circles. They were nicknamed the Digital Guardians, the keepers of the department's soul, and at its helm was Detective Jack Riley. The title still felt foreign to him at times. He wore a simple suit now instead of his clerk's uniform, and the detective's shield felt heavy in his pocket, a constant reminder of the world he had reluctantly inherited. He was still quiet, still meticulous, but his presence now carried a weight of authority that had nothing to do with his rank. He was the man who had read the fine print. He was the man who had brought down a king. His new office had a window, but he rarely looked out of it. His focus was on the screens that lined the walls, displaying the ceaseless flow of the department's data. It was the same data he had always watched, but now he watched it as a guardian, not just a keeper. The anomaly isn't in the fuel consumption logs, Officer Chen, Riley said, his voice calm and even. He was speaking to a young, bright-eyed rookie, barely a year out of the academy, who sat beside him. The numbers there are all within standard deviation. You're looking at the wrong ledger. The young officer, Maria Chen, was the first hand-picked member of his unit. She was a digital native who could think in code, but Riley was teaching her to think in patterns, in stories. But the patrol cars in the 3rd Precinct are consistently logging 15% more fuel than any other, she insisted, pointing to a graph on her screen. It has to be skimming. It's not, Riley said. He manipulated his own keyboard, and a different set of data filled the main screen maintenance requests. Stop looking at the fuel and look at the tires. The 3rd Precinct's maintenance budget for tire replacement is 30% lower than the average. Their officers are running their tires bald to save a few bucks on the budget and look good for the brass. He zoomed in on 2 recent accident reports from that precinct. Both incidents involved patrol cars losing traction in the rain, minor accidents, but they could have been fatal. The problem isn't corruption. It's a misguided focus on the wrong metrics. They're trying so hard to save money that they're risking lives. He leaned back, letting the lesson sink in. Our job isn't just to find the criminals, Chen. It's to find the flaws in the system that create them. Integrity isn't just about catching crooks. It's about ensuring the ledger is balanced in every single column. Chen stared at the screen, her eyes wide with a new understanding. He wasn't just teaching her how to be a data analyst. He was teaching her how to be a true guardian of the law. This was his paying it forward, his way of ensuring that another thorn could never again take root in the dark, unexamined corners of the department. He was inoculating the next generation. The changes were felt throughout the precinct. Captain Davies, now the permanent chief, ran the department with a gruff, no-nonsense integrity. Detective Rostova had become one of his most trusted homicide investigators. The ordeal had burned away her arrogant ambition, leaving behind a sharper, more thoughtful, and more compassionate detective. She and Riley now shared a professional respect that was one of the strongest bonds in the building. They rarely spoke of what happened, but it was always there between them, a shared understanding of how close the department had come to oblivion. The final symbolic image of Oakhaven's second spring was not in the gleaming new data center, but in the main lobby, where a self-aggrandizing portrait of Marcus Thorne had once hung. There was now a simple, elegant memorial wall of polished black granite. It wasn't for officers killed in the line of duty. There was another wall for that. This one was new, dedicated by Chief Davies to the Guardians of the Shield, those whose actions, seen or unseen, had upheld the true honor of the badge. There were only a handful of names engraved in gold leaf so far. Among them was evidence clerk Albert Pops Callahan, who, after a full recovery, had finally, blissfully retired to a small fishing boat in Florida, a department hero. Riley often found himself stopping by the wall at the end of his shift. He would stand there, long after most had gone home, the quiet hum of the building a familiar comfort. This evening, he stood before the wall, his gaze on Pops's name, a small smile on his face. He saw his own reflection mirrored on the polished stone, a faint, ghost-like image superimposed over the golden letters. The man staring back at him was no longer the invisible archivist from the basement. His shoulders were straighter, The perpetual uncertainty in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. He was no longer a man hidden in the shadows of the past, cataloging the stories of others. He was a man standing firmly in the light, a guardian of the future, writing his own. If this story of a quiet hero's courage resonated with you, if it reminds you that integrity is a light that no darkness can extinguish, please leave a comment below. Share this story with anyone who believes that one person can make a difference. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to join our community and never miss another story of justice and vindication.